They told me my land was the perfect place to send their water. And I remember thinking, real comment first. If that's true, then I get to decide where that water stops. I didn't say it out loud back then. Not yet. But that thought stuck with me, like a splinter you can't quite reach. See, I live just outside a small town in eastern Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just 6 acres I bought 15 years ago, when land was still cheap and nobody cared much about what sat beyond the county line. A small cedar house near the top of a long, gentle slope, and below it open field that I kept mostly clear, except for a few stubborn trees that never quite agreed with the idea of being cut down. It's quiet out there. The kind of quiet where you notice when something feels off. And that week, something felt off. We hadn't had rain in days. The air was dry enough to crack your lips. And yet one morning as I walked down the slope with my coffee, I noticed the ground under my Brits was soft. Not everywhere, just a narrow strip like someone had dragged a wet brush across the land from the far edge of my property toward the middle. At first, I figured maybe I'd left a hose running, or maybe there was a leak somewhere underground. But the pattern was too straight, too deliberate, like it was trying to lead somewhere. And I've always been the kind of person who follows things like that, even when I probably shouldn't. So I followed it uphill, step by step, the mud getting thicker, the grass darker until I reached the fence line that separates my land from the new development they started building last year. You know the kind. Identical houses, bright siding, concrete driveways so smooth they look like they've never seen a tire. All perched just a little higher than my property, like they were built to look down on it. And that's when I saw it. A white PVC pipe about 4 inches in across, sticking out from under the fence at an angle that pointed straight into my land, and out of it, steady as a heartbeat. Water was trickling down. Not a gush, not dramatic, just constant, quiet, like it had been doing it long enough that it didn't need to hurry anymore. I stood there for a minute just watching it, listening to that soft, stubborn flow, and I remember laughing under my breath because it felt so ridiculous, like someone had decided my property was their problem solution without ever bothering to ask. Behind me, my field sloped downward, wide and open, and behind that fence, their land sloped neatly toward me, every driveway, every patch of grass angled just right, so that when water needed somewhere to go, it would end up exactly where I was standing. It wasn't an accident, not really. It was design. So, I drove up there that same afternoon, dust kicking up behind my truck as I pulled into their temporary side office, a little prefab building that smelled like coffee and fresh drywall. And inside there was a guy sitting behind a desk, mid-40s maybe, clean shirt, pin tapping against a clipboard like he was already bored with whatever I was about to say. I told him what I'd found, kept it simple, didn't raise my voice, just facts. There's a pipe on your side of the fence. It's draining water onto my land, and I want to know who approved that. He listened, nodded once or twice, then leaned back in his chair, like he'd had this conversation 100 times before, and said, "That's just stormwater." I remember blinking at him, because the sky outside was clear as glass, and I said, "We haven't had a storm." He smiled a little, not friendly exactly, more like patient in a way that felt rehearsed, and said, "It's designed for future rainfall." I asked him if there was an easement, if there was any kind of agreement that allowed them to direct runoff onto private property. And he tapped that pen again, slower this time, and said, "Water flows downhill. Concrete just helps it find the way." That answer sat wrong with me, the kind of wrong that doesn't hit all at once, but builds piece by piece until you realize you're being talked around instead of talked to. So I went home, dug out my paperwork, the original survey from when I bought the land, the county records, even pulled up the approved grading plans for their development online. And that's when things got interesting, because according to those plans, they weren't supposed to be sending water to me at all. There were supposed to be underground retention tanks, big ones, designed to hold and manage runoff so it didn't overwhelm surrounding land. But those tanks weren't there, not even close. Instead, all that water had been given a shortcut, and that shortcut was my property. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at those documents, the afternoon light coming through the window, catching the edges of the paper. And I remember thinking, this isn't just lazy, it's intentional. And that's the moment everything shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding settling in. They had made a decision, and now I was going to have to make one too. I didn't call anyone right away. That's the part people usually don't expect when I tell this story. They think I went straight to a lawyer or marched back up there ready to start a fight. But that's not how I'm wired. I've lived out here long enough to know that once you start something like that, it doesn't stay small. It turns into paperwork, meetings, people choosing sides, and suddenly your quiet piece of land isn't quiet anymore. So I waited, not out of fear, more like I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made my move. And in a way, I guess I knew something else was coming, because water like that, it doesn't show its full hand right away. It just keeps moving, keeps building, waiting for the right moment to remind you it's not something you control. That moment came about 4 days later, when the sky finally broke open. One of those heavy Tennessee rains that doesn't ease in. It just drops like a curtain all at once, loud enough on the roof that you have to raise your voice just to think. I stood on my porch watching it, arms crossed, coffee going cold in my hand, and I remember looking down at that strip of land where the ground had already been soft earlier in the week. And within maybe 20 minutes, I could see it happening. The water wasn't soaking in anymore. It was moving fast. I grabbed my jacket and walked down the slope, rain soaking through before I even made it halfway, boots sinking into mud that hadn't been there before. And by the time I reached the fence line, that quiet little trickle I'd seen days earlier had turned into something else entirely. The pipe was pushing water out in a steady stream now. Not violent, not chaotic, just relentless, like it had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. It hit my land and immediately started carving a path, cutting through the soil like it had done it before, like it already knew the route. I stood there in the rain, watching my field change shape in real time. A shallow channel forming where there had been grass just hours before, and for the first time, I felt something close to anger. Not explosive, not loud, just deep and steady, like a weight settling in my chest. By morning, the rain had passed, but the damage stayed. Part of my lower fence leaned at an angle it had never leaned before. The ground beneath it washed out just enough to make it unstable, and that channel, it was still there. A thin scar running across my land, proof that what I'd seen wasn't temporary. That's when I picked up the phone. First call was to a civil engineer a friend had recommended. A guy named Mark Ellison. Older, practical, the kind of person who listens more than he talks. I walked him through everything, sent over photos, copies of the plans, and he didn't sugarcoat it. They're concentrating runoff, he said, and sending it on a private property without proper discharge control. That's not how it's supposed to work. I asked him what I could do, and there was a pause on the line before he answered, like he was choosing his words carefully. You can fight it, he said, but it'll take time and water doesn't wait. That line stuck with me. Water doesn't wait. I made a couple more calls after that. A surveyor to confirm boundaries. Someone at the county environmental office who sounded tired, but not surprised. And every answer I got circled back to the same idea. Yes, what they're doing is likely wrong. Yes, it can be challenged. But no, it won't stop overnight. And meanwhile, every time it rains, your land is going to take the hit. That didn't sit right with me. Not at first anyway, but because I couldn't just stand there and watch my property slowly reshape itself around someone else's decisions. So I started thinking, not about how to stop the water entirely, because that would have crossed a line legally, and I wasn't interested in making myself the problem, but how to manage it, how to take what they'd forced onto my land and make it behave differently. I spent a couple nights sketching ideas at my kitchen table. Nothing fancy, just lines and notes, thinking about flow, about slope, about how water spreads when it doesn't have a single path to follow. And eventually, something clicked. I didn't need to block it. I just needed to slow it down and take away its direction. A few days later, I started digging. Not a wall, not a dam, a trench. Wide, shallow, running along the upper edge of my property, right where that pipe discharged, lined with gravel, so it could absorb and disperse the flow, instead of letting it cut straight through. It wasn't dramatic work, just me and a rented excavator, a couple long days under the sun, measuring twice, adjusting as I went, making sure everything stayed within what the county would consider acceptable, because the last thing I needed was someone turning this back on me. Before I finished, I filed the paperwork, had it inspected, kept everything above board, and that part mattered more than anything, because I wasn't just building something physical. I was building a position I could stand on if things escalated. When it was done, it didn't look like much, just a strip of gravel cutting across the edge of my land, subtle enough that most people wouldn't even notice it unless they were looking for it. But I knew what it would do. 2 days later, the rain came back. Not as heavy as before, but steady, consistent enough to test what I'd built. I stood in the same spot near the fence, hands in my pockets this time, watching as the water began to flow out of that pipe again, gathering speed as it hit the slope. And then it reached the trench. For a second, nothing seemed different, like maybe I'd miscalculated, like maybe it would just push right through and keep going. Not stop completely, just slowed, spread out, losing that sharp forward edge it had before. The water filled the trench, soaked into the gravel, and then almost gently, it began to move sideways instead of straight ahead, drifting along the boundary line instead of cutting deeper into my field. And here's the part one didn't fully expect. Once it lost its path onto my land, it started looking for the next lowest point, which wasn't down my slope anymore. It was back toward theirs. It didn't rush, didn't surge, just gradually shifted like it was reconsidering its options. And over the next hour, I could see it happening. Their perfectly graded lawns beginning to darken, patches of grass turning soft, driveways collecting thin sheets of water that hadn't been there before. It wasn't destruction, not yet, just inconvenience, the kind you can't ignore for long. I went inside, dried off, and about 30 minutes later my phone rang. I looked at the number, recognized it from the side office, and for a second I just let it ring. Not out of spite, more like I wanted to decide how I was going to answer before I picked up. When I finally did, his voice was different this time. Still controlled, but tighter, like something underneath it had shifted. "Your trench," he said. "It's redirecting water back onto our property." I leaned against the counter, looked out the window at the rain still falling, and said, "It's not redirecting. It's managing what's already there." There was a pause, shorter this time, and then he said, "It's affecting the homes." I let that sit for a second, then answered, "Your pipe's been affecting my land all week." Another pause, longer now, heavy in a way that felt like he was realizing this wasn't going to be as simple as he'd hoped. "We need you to remove it," he said finally, and I remember smiling just a little, not because I was enjoying it, but because the question had finally come around to where it should have been from the start. "Will you remove the pipe?" I asked. Silence. Not static, not a dropped call, just nothing on the other end for a few seconds that felt longer than they were. And in that silence I could almost hear the shift. The moment where this stopped being a minor issue and started becoming something they couldn't control anymore. That silence on the phone didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough to say everything that needed to be said. He cleared his throat, gave me something non-committal about reviewing options, and the call ended without anything close to an agreement. And for the first time since I'd found that pipe, I felt like the ground had shifted just a little. Not physically this time, but in terms of control. Up until then, everything had been happening to me, decisions made somewhere uphill, literally and figuratively, and all I'd been doing was reacting. But now, for better or worse, I had inserted myself into the equation. The next storm came 2 days later, heavier than the last. The kind of rain that turns everything gray and blurs the distance, so the houses up the slope look like they're floating in it. I didn't even bother with a jacket this time. I just walked straight out and took my usual spot near the fence, like I was showing up for something I already knew the outcome of. The pipe started flowing early, pushing water hard into the trench, filling it faster than before. And for a moment, I'll admit there was a flicker of doubt, a thought that maybe I'd underestimated it. Maybe this time it would overflow and cut straight through again, undo everything I'd built. But it held. The gravel did what it was supposed to do, slowing, spreading, absorbing just enough to take the edge off. And then, like before, but more pronounced now, the water began to drift sideways and then back. You could actually see it if you watched long enough. That subtle reversal, the moment gravity found a new argument and followed it up the slope. Things changed quickly. What had been minor inconvenience last time started turning into something else. Puddles deepening into standing water, the clean lines of their driveways breaking under pressure as water pulled where it wasn't meant to. And then I saw it. One of the retaining walls along the edge of a backyard, Concrete and stone, solid looking from a distance, starting to darken along the base. Little beads of water pushing through, like the structure itself was sweating under the strain. That's when the calls started coming in faster, not just from the site manager this time, but from numbers I didn't recognize, voices layered with concern that hadn't been there before. Homeowners, I figured. People who had bought into something they were told was stable, controlled, safe, and now were watching water creep into places it wasn't supposed to go. Not out of cruelty, just because this wasn't a conversation I could have 10 different ways with 10 different people. It needed to happen in one place with the people who made the decisions. And it did. The county got involved after that storm, inspectors showing up in trucks that looked like they'd seen 100 situations just like this. Boots in the mud, clipboards out. Not in a rush, because people like that don't rush, they observe. I stood off to the side while they watched the water move. One of them crouching near the trench, another walking the line up toward the development, tracing the path it took like they were reading something written into the land itself. They asked questions, not loud, not aggressive, but pointed in a way that made it clear they already knew more than they were being told. Why wasn't the approved retention system installed? Why was runoff being concentrated instead of dispersed? Why was private land being used as an outlet, without documented permission? I didn't have to say much. The answers coming from the other side weren't strong enough to carry the weight of the situation. And you could feel it, that slow unraveling of confidence, as each explanation landed weaker than the last. After that, things moved quickly, at least compared to how they had before. The offers started coming in. First, small, almost dismissive, like they were still hoping this could be smoothed over without real change. They said they'd repair my fence, bring it back to better than it was, like a straight line of what could fix a problem that ran deeper than that. I told them no. Then it was compensation, a number that might have sounded appealing if this had just been about inconvenience. But it wasn't. It was about control, about not letting someone decide that my land was expendable just because it sat downhill. I said no again. Then they offered to regrade parts of my field, lay fresh soil, plant grass like a layer of green could somehow convince the water to behave differently next time. I remember looking at the guy when he said that, really looking at him and just shaking my head a little. Grass doesn't stop water, I told him. And that was the end of that version of the conversation. By the time they came back again, the tone had changed. Less suggestion, more acknowledgement, like they had finally accepted that the problem wasn't going to go away unless they addressed it at the source. They said they were willing to fix the drainage properly, to revisit the original plans. And for the first time, I listened without already knowing my answer. But listening doesn't mean agreeing. It just means you're ready to say exactly what you need. I told them the pipe had to go completely removed, not capped, not redirected somewhere else, quietly gone. I told them the original retention system needed to be installed as it was designed. No shortcuts, no value engineering, no creative interpretations. I told them my land needed to be restored, not patched, not covered up, but brought back to what it was before any of this started. And then I added one more thing. The trench stays as backup, as insurance, as a reminder. They didn't like that last part. I could see it in the way they looked at each other, calculating, weighing cost against control, because that trench represented something they couldn't fully dictate anymore. They hesitated, not outright refusing, but not agreeing either, stuck in that space where people hoped maybe time will solve the problem for them. And then the sky opened up again. Another storm, fast and heavy, like it had been waiting for that exact moment to make its point. And this time, the consequences didn't stay subtle. 2 garages uphill flooded, not catastrophically, not enough to make the news, but enough to ruin floors, damage stored belongings, enough to turn inconvenience into urgency. That was it. The hesitation disappeared almost overnight. Within a week, equipment showed up. Real equipment this time, not temporary fixes, but the kind that digs deep, reshapes land, installs systems meant to last longer than anyone involved in the decision. They tore up sections of the development, installed the retention tanks that had been on the original plans all along, reworked the grading so water had somewhere appropriate to go. And just like that, the pipe that had started all of this disappeared. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, just gone like it had never been there in the first place. My land dried out over the next couple weeks. The trench, sitting quiet, doing nothing now, which was exactly what it was supposed to do. And every once in a while, I'll walk down there, stand near that line where everything changed, and think about how close it came to going a different way. How easy it would have been to ignore it at the start, to accept a little water, then a little more, until eventually it wasn't my land shaping the water anymore, but the other way around. People ask me sometimes if I feel like I won, and I never quite know how to answer that because it doesn't feel like winning. Not in the way people expect. It feels more like holding your ground long enough that someone else finally realizes they can't take it from you. But here's the part one still think about. Those homeowners uphill. The ones who had nothing to do with the decision. The ones who just trusted that everything had been done right. They ended up in the middle of it anyway, dealing with the consequences before anything got fixed. And I wonder sometimes if I had handled it differently, faster, quieter, would it have spared them that? Or would it have just let the problem keep sliding downhill until it was too late to push back at all? So, I'll leave you with that. If you were in my place, would you have done the same thing? Built that trench? Pushed the problem back where it came from? Forced the issue into the open? Or would you have taken the easier road and hoped someone else fixed it eventually? Let me know what you think. Because out here, right and wrong don't always show up as clean as people like to believe. And sometimes standing your ground means someone else has to feel it first. If this story made you think, or reminded you of something you've seen before, hit like, subscribe, and drop your take in the comments. I read more of them than you'd expect.